the ingredients that serves as a major contributing factor to my abiding love for horror lies in the sheer variety within the genre. The many time periods you can set these stories in. The abundant settings your story can take place in. The magnitude of genres it can occupy, and of course, the stars of the show, the monster types. Two subdivisions of the genre that are my absolute favy are the anthology format and documentaries. I could go on about how no other film class enjoys as many introspections, retrospectives, biopics, or behind-the-scenes features the likes that Fear Fiction boasts. After all, it's not like anyone does romance conventions and comedies don't get their own documentaries. This neatly brings us to today's episode of an in-depth look into the film that burst the balloon of the genre and transcended horror. It crossed over to the public consciousness and terrified an entire generation of children. Not bad for a made-for-TV movie. Consider me Inkarnate, your tour guide down the River Styx, only this time we disembark aboard the SS Georgie and sail down memory lane on this nostalgia trip. The documentary appropriately opens with Stephen King reminiscing on the humble beginnings of his famous story. He recounted a routine trip to the mechanics, traveling there by foot, when a certain landmark triggered what would serve as the germ for his inspiration. When crossing over a bridge, King was reminded of the tale of the three billy goats, and distinctly remembered thinking how terrifying it'd be for something to reach out for him from under the overpass like the troll from the fairy tale. Little by little, layer by layer, the author hammered out 1,300 pages of dread from the bedtime story of the Billy Goat's Gruff. And to think, he came up with that horror story before facing the true nightmare of the mechanic's bill. Harrowing stuff. How interesting that Stephen King thought of a scare from a storybook that called back to his childhood, considering the monster he was about to craft in his own story was so intrinsically linked to children. From here, the cast and crew open up about their incredulity over the longevity that the miniseries has enjoyed. One of the actors mentions its timeless appeal lies in how the teenagers, enduring tribulations, are able to overcome adversity by banding together. Others reference how, even though most TV movies often got memory hold, the fact that it has consistently played on cable has allowed for a broader, younger audience to gain exposure to it. As horror fans, we all naturally can name drop films we love and grew up on, but every so often there is that film that frightened us beyond jump scares and surface level cheap thrills. Something that chills us to the bone. After over 30 years, I can confidently attest that 1990's It left its indelible mark on all those brave enough to have watched, or those viewers unaware of what they were getting into. We wear our scar tissue proudly. Before we plunge headfirst into the making and legacy of Clowntown Derry, let's say we do a deep dive with this video's sponsors. Think of the power to tune out the whole world placed in your hands. Now think again, because Jabra Headsets puts that power in your ears. Listen closely. From workout earbuds to Bluetooth music headsets and office hearing devices. So, if other brands play your music sounding like a broken record, march to the beat of a different tune with Jabra. If you're an HD snob like me, you probably buy Samsung for all your major electronics. Catch up on your favorite horror classics on one of their Ultra HD TVs. Watch one of Scream Factory's Blu-rays on their 4K players. Keep up with updates from 80s horror documentary In Search of Darkness on a high-end tablet. Subscribe to your favorite YouTuber through one of their Galaxy phones. I have so many Samsung devices I've always thought they should be paying me. Well, now they can, and you can help. If you use the link in the description for either Samsung or Jabra purchases, it'll help the channel out tremendously. With the promotional considerations accounted for, it's on with the show. After having adapted the book Carrie, Lawrence Cohen earned himself the go-to screenwriter status when it came to horror adaptations. As luck would have it, fortune rang his phone when his agent was approached by producers who'd set up a Stephen King project at ABC, and then opportunity knocked at his door when FedEx delivered 3 boxes containing the original It manuscript. And you thought the book itself was long. Wouldn't you know it, what convinced the writer to adapt the book was reading the introduction of The Tragic Demise of Georgie. Let's be honest, that opening chapter is one hell of a hook. It's no wonder then that it was a point of frustration that when Larry met with the studio brass, they didn't share the same enthusiasm because they had trouble understanding what it was. Despite the writer's best attempts to repeatedly summarize the threat that the clown represented, the response was inevitably summed up with the question, what is it? A bit of a roadblock getting the bigwigs on board and penetrate the thick skull of the unimaginative when they can't even wrap their heads around what the monster even is. Such is the disparity between the visionaries and the money men. As discouraging as that initial impression might have seemed, a twist of fate await Larry on his plane trip back home when, lo and behold, he spotted seated near him reading his script just so happened to be Bob Iger, the head of ABC programming. By the end of the flight, the plane landed at the airport and Cohen had landed himself the gig, with Iger having enjoyed the script and given Cohen the green light. Someone who wasn't as fortunate with his attachment to the project was one George Romero. As gung-ho as the Living Dead director was to helm, he worried that the network interference would stand in the way of his vision. His concerns were sadly warranted. This was a real shame because, as Lawrence Cohen puts it, he, the writer, and Romero, the director, meshed well not just in their vision for Stephen King's It, but also bouncing ideas one after another and one off the other. Sure enough, the studio started chipping away at the runtime, and George Romero, seeing the writing on the wall, gracefully bowed out. George always did have something of a curse when it came to involvement with Stephen King projects. That sordid history is a story for another day, and frankly, the show must go on. The producer's gamble to roll the dice on a writer to fill the director's chair paid off when genre regular Tommy Lee Wallace was brought in, especially considering his experience in abbreviating novels into smaller, more workable scripts. Not only had Wallace collaborated often with John Carpenter, but his own directing duties included sequels such as Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and Fright Night 2. Whereas filmmaking typically adheres to the 3-act structure, this is expanded to 7 for TV films, which turned out perfectly for this It adaptation, 1 act dedicated to each of the 7 members of the Losers Club. Not surprisingly, the director was drawn into Part 1, the childhood story, like the writer and studio head before him, and unsurprisingly, he faced problems properly adapting the Part 2 adult script. As glad as I am that they got Tim Curry to provide commentary, it was sad seeing his health having deteriorated so. Brief as it was a welcome sight at the snapshot of the many villains that Stephen King has penned, all of whom are iconic, and this rogues gallery was about to induct its newest member. The use of the Conan O'Brien interview demonstrates the far-reaching effect that King has had on pop culture. To Conan's point, being that King was one of the first people to depict clowns as scary, he asks Stephen if he feared them as a child, to which the author explains how truly terrifying clowns indeed can be.
Their faces like painted nightmares.
To accentuate this point, focus then shifts to grainy film reel of clowns from old-timey stage plays, back in the day carnivals, or black and white TV shows. Of course, they had to mention Ronald McDonald. At long last, they highlight news reports of colorophobia, the fear of clowns.
Finally!
Hey, horror genre, where is that documentary? You hear me. What I had expected was the mention of John Wayne Gacy, who had dressed as a jester called Pogo the Clown. What I hadn't expected is that this serial killer had actually made a painting of Pennywise. It's nice to feel appreciated. One author astutely revealed that It the Clown is a metaphor for the 50s decade, appearing safe and nostalgic on the outside, but underneath the surface, it was something else. I very much appreciated the mention of killer clowns in entertainment media to give a broader showcase of the genre and the place Pennywise occupies within that pantheon. They even referenced the clown sightings from about 8 years or so ago, when they were being reported on the news. With the recent passing of David Warner reminding me of how the caliber of actors we used to get breathed life into their performances to raise whatever roles they played into iconic characters, it was these very film chops that drew the casting of one Tim Curry. This was the first of me ever hearing that it was Curry's animated performance in the Rocky Horror Picture Show that landed him the villain role in It. But I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. The ABC network had shortlisted names like Roddy McDowall, Malcolm McDowell, even Alice Cooper to play Pennywise, but much like Michael Keaton's Batman or Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger, it really did have to be Tim Curry to perfectly capture and immortalize our first impression of this genre-defining character. Shout out to the documentary for highlighting the many memorable performances Tim Curry has given us, especially his Lord of Darkness antagonist from Legend. The filmmakers were so sold on Tim that he didn't even have to audition for the role. They just gave it to him, and boy, did they get their money's worth. He did what all great thespians do, which was actualize his part. From written word to role of a lifetime, from print to performance, adding their own spin to make the portrayal uniquely theirs, and it fit like a glove. You take one part talented performer having a field day with his role, one part director allowing for creative license, and what you got is a formula for success. Or in this case, the stuff of nightmares. The acclaim heaped upon Tim Curry by this documentary further cements him as this film's selling point and the reason it has lasted the test of time. His performance truly was a career achievement. I had no idea that the film was shot in the Great White North, but hey, because it was cheap to shoot there, there was a surge of productions migrating up there. And with a studio house with plenty of blue-collar workers, it made this sweet spot all the sweeter. Next. So, this segment deals with the stock standard outcasts that tend to populate all of Stephen King's stories. It is great to hear how the children couldn't find a sense of family to cope with their trials, except with each other. They didn't feel like they belonged, even in their own home. The task that lay before the child actors fell into three requirements: a sense of humor, that delicate tightrope of portraying painful yet heartfelt scenes, and displaying fear. Yeah, that last one must have been a layup. It was a nice touch to hear that they had something of a camp so that the child actors could meet their adult counterparts in order to develop mannerisms in their characters to bridge the gap between age and different actor portrayals. The staff prided itself on having so many familiar faces with TV actors, and the addition of Tim Curry, all the stars were now aligning. It's a shame then that the adult version didn't shine as brightly as the Part 1 kid story. They go into detail regarding the depth and gravitas that Jonathan Brandis brought to his role as Bill Denborough. I was saddened to hear of his passing, especially at such a young age. It's here they discuss not only the score of the film, but how it was informed by the direction of the child cast. It was intriguing hearing about Beverly and her father. The actor that played him actually was her biological dad. It was uncomfortable for both real-life father and daughter to occupy the dynamic that the abusive relationship between them demanded, which understandably would be expected. When they name-dropped Three's Company from John Ritter's acting career, I was like, that's where I remember him from. Okay, mystery solved. It was that acting credit that made him the biggest of the TV stars. Despite that, not only was he a humble presence, his joking on set made for a relaxed working environment with not just the adult stars, but the teen actors as well. The personal tics and gestures that child and adult actors develop showed a dedication to their craft. The camaraderie of the youngsters to help each other cope and overcome childhood obstacles was palpable. The suicide in the film still gives weight to the trauma that the encounter with the clown conjures up, and the doc highlights it pretty well. How it was too much to handle. Of all the familiar faces I saw and recognized, easily the most forgettable is Seth Green. Ugh. The actor seemed like the biggest waste of potential for what the character was supposed to be. If I'm being fair though, the adult version also didn't live up to the comedic promise of what this personality was supposed to emulate. As much as the kids misbehaved on set, it was endearing to hear that it brought them closer together. They touched on the orgy scene, which I still can't believe that King wrote into the book. Moving on. The kids get a lecture for their unprofessionalism, both from director and producer. Even the writer had to take them aside and give them a stern finger wagging. Turns out the adults were just as rowdy. This would be another one of those Stephen King tropes. Best not to make a drinking game out of these. It was good to hear that the child actor playing Henry Bowers took influence from Dennis Hopper for his depiction. He really did look the part of a bully. The actor playing Bowers would always console his co-stars after each take to remind them that it was just a scene, and the expletives he hurled their way were not him, not his thoughts. In this particular case, they cast the adult version of the character after they found the child actor. As an aside, I always found Henry Bowers to be one of the more interesting characters. The thought of a monster pulling the strings of a man and keeping his sanity on a short leash is a unique twist for the story. Apparently, he was a little too convincing in his role since the child actor was actually freaked out by the adult counterpart. Referencing Tim Curry's acting prowess again, one staff member notes how his comedic performance lured audiences in just the way Pennywise did with Georgie. Speaking of, the sunny backdrop of the rain scene with Georgie was actually helped by the lighting. Even though sunshine peeks through the downpour, it adds to the eeriness as if daylight is being choked out by showering rain. One scene that didn't make it to the final cut was where the dismembered Georgie was brought to his mother's doorstep by a fireman. This was a sign of things to come, considering the cutbacks that had to be made because of TV censors, especially with advertisers keeping close watch. ABC censorship staff rejected so much of the film that every note that they gave would have required recutting the whole movie. When the filmmakers, to their credit, stood firm that they weren't willing to endure such heavy editing, their resolve paid off as they were allowed to move forward without the integrity of the film facing compromise. I'm glad that they went into detail on the album scene where Pennywise is seen in a photograph of Derry from the 1920s that comes to life. I had no idea of the intricate machine they put together behind the scenes just to get the album to turn its own pages. The entire scene certainly made for creepy imagery during the movie. According to the wardrobe department, the Pennywise makeup actually dictated the clown's costume. The amount of insight they gave into the heavy prosthetics Tim Curry wore, or rather endured, for his Lord of Darkness role in Legend, and the laborious process of removal must have made the Pennywise makeup seem like a walk in the park by comparison. Furthermore, and fortunately for him, Curry was able to have creative control on his makeup so that it didn't have so much prosthetics. They ditched the exaggerated cheekbones and extended chin to cartoonize his face, as the director put it, as well as dialed back the amount of color for the makeup for a more minimalist approach. This meant more of the actor could shine through, and the expressions wouldn't be limited. The realization that the fear factor would come from the actor, not just from the makeup, was also the reason why Robert Englund was chosen to play Freddy in the first Elm Street, and why he was asked to return for the sequel. I'd be lying if I said that word of the final look drawing inspiration from Lon Chaney, the King of the Monsters, didn't put a smile on my face. Like all good villains, Tim Curry would keep his distance from the kids off-screen. Rather fittingly, the documentary referenced the portrayals of Pennywise of the Universal monsters, the Mummy, Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, because I heard that they were one of the inspirations for Pennywise.
I had an idea when I was in Colorado that I wanted to write a really long book that had all the monsters in it. I figured if people think that I'm a horror writer, I never considered myself to be that myself. I'm just a writer. I thought to myself, okay, if they want that, let me see how much I can do, and I'll get all the monsters together that I possibly can. I'll get the vampire, and I'll get the werewolf, and I'll even get the mummy, although the mummy has never really scared me, because it's like, oh, the mummy's after us, let's all walk. It's not a terribly scary monster, but he had to be there because he's one of the classics. And then I thought to myself, there ought to be one sort of binding, horrible, nasty, gross creature, the kind of thing that just, you just don't want to see that. It makes you scream just to see it. And I thought to myself, what scares children more than anything else in the world? And the answer was clown. How do you say clown in German?
Just like that.
Say clown.
As happy as I am that they spoke candidly of the inferior quality of the adult Part 2, it remains not without its merits as referenced from the scenes of the fortune cookie dinner and the little old lady living in Beverly's house. I had forgotten that the old woman that grown-up Beverly encountered mimicked the voice of her father. Not only is the corpse version of the woman played by her father, but it was actually supposed to be more gruesome with the application of worms on the face. Hey, it worked for Jason, right? The sewers were such a centerpiece for the children's Part 1, It was impressive, the design that went into this labyrinth set. Oh, the battery acid scene. This was the film's
Wolfman's got gnar
moment. I'm a big fan of no wasted motion, meaning as little on the cutting room floor as possible. Therefore, hearing that, as youths, the children were supposed to see it as a clown, but viewed a decrepit Pennywise once they were adults, allowed for the latter concept to have been salvaged by the battery acid burn. Tim Curry, being the consummate team player, volunteered to wear that particular prosthetic. Oh, the shower scene. Hey, it worked for Freddy, right? The Chinese restaurant dinner was described as their alien scene because the adults weren't allowed to see what was in the fortune cookies. It was amusing hearing the grief involved with the Stanley Uris actor playing out the scene with his talking head in the fridge. I can only imagine the claustrophobia of that, not to mention that no matter what food was in the fridge, you gotta believe he didn't get any leftovers. All this and it's a spider? Both actors and director expressed their disappointment with the finale of The Monster. How do you think the rest of us felt? All these years later, it looked like something out of Howard the Duck. It's actually not a bad design, it's just that it doesn't belong in this story. I didn't realize that there was actually an actor in there instead of a fully animatronic puppet. To add insult to injury, the director was already on site in a different project when someone else had taken over editing duty and failed to darken the film reel to the director's specifications. I see what he's saying because the scenes are too bright and you can see everything that should have been darkened for a more murky, atmospheric feel. The writer and director lament the omission of Pennywise from the end scene and we're along with them. Stephen King watched the miniseries in a private screening and the crew was elated that he enjoyed it. The gamble on this film paid off when 30 million people tuned in to catch the saga. The press was positive, and the miniseries even won the award for its score at the 43rd Annual Emmys. The abundance of praise for Tim Curry is well deserved. He really is the Robert Englund of this miniseries and the face of the killer clown genre, if we're being honest. Mind you, this was the home run reception the TV movie received upon release. Think of the acclaim it has garnered in the near 33 years since its premiere. Both cast and crew weigh in on their gratitude over participation in this little engine that could, their disbelief that it would ever reach such heights upon debut, especially a third of a century later, and what the film did for them and the greater horror genre. Okay, full disclosure, I missed the entire Pennywise craze as a kid. I didn't see it when it aired and therefore didn't get caught up in the tidal wave. When I first watched it in the 8th grade, it was comparable to a drive-in date experience. My girlfriend at the time, who let me borrow it, was freaked out watching the film. Whereas me, well, let's just say my attention was focused elsewhere. I didn't see the film in its entirety until well into my adulthood, once I had gotten my own apartment. As far as this doc is concerned, the tidbits and the trivia, the behind the scenes and the mainstream all serve to make this a standout documentary that went the extra mile and was well worth the wait. Rather than a straightforward retelling of what went on once the camera stopped rolling, I loved the broader strokes that they paint the big picture with. They mention Stephen King's other adaptations, Tim Curry's iconic villains, the honest conversations we can have around the spider ending, on-set interviews with Pennywise himself recorded during filming, the backstory of the story, the origins of the clown, the Ronald McDonald reference. It all just makes for a more all-inclusive stay in its stomping grounds of Derry, Maine. Well, that's it for me for this coverage. You can call it a wrap. Be sure to tune into this year's Treehouse of Horror for their homage to Stephen King's It. I've been Inkarnate, reminding you, I ain't just a big deal, I'm the real deal.
See you in your dreams. Oh, come back anytime. Bring your friends.
If you're resigned to your fate, time to subscribe to your fears.
Warn your friends. Warn everyone.